Okay, it's my great pleasure to welcome Cheryl Tipp to give our key talk for this evening. Cheryl's the curator of wildlife and environmental sounds at the British Library. She's been doing this, embarrassing, I suppose, for her, for some years, shall we say. And her main remit is to share in the expertise in curating the British Library's collection of sounds. And I think she's going to give us a fascinating insight and expose of the kind of work that she does. So, Cheryl, over to you.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation to come and speak, particularly to Joe for putting my name forward. Yep, I'm Cheryl Tipp. I'm Curator of Wildlife and Environmental Sounds at the British Library. I've been there for 20 years now, which is quite a long time. And it's interesting that you mentioned Patrick Seller earlier, because he was one of the co-founders of the section that I work in. And he was incredibly supportive to me when I first started 20 years ago, and was a constant source of encouragement and enthusiasm. So it's lovely to hear his name again today. So if we just, oh, is it not going to let me do it? Oh, it does. Good. Thank God for that. Okay. So, um, as I say, I'm Curator of Wildlife Environmental Sounds at the British Library in the Sound Archive. So the British Library, there's two sites, one in London near St Pancras and one up in Yorkshire. It's the National Library of the United Kingdom. It was founded in 1973 by an Act of Parliament, and it contains over 170 million items. The collection is growing every day. So it's very hard to keep track of how much we've got, but it's about 170 million items. It covers a range of materials and media, from printed books, as you'd expect in a library, to newspapers, maps. We have a wonderful visual arts department. We have manuscripts, we have a philatelic collection, electronic books and journals. There's 20 billion pages of UK web content that we collect. And there's also the National Sound Archive, which is where I work. So the British Library Sound Archive wasn't always the British Library Sound Archive. It was formed in 1955 as the British Institute of Recorded Sound, and we were based down in South Kensington. But we joined the British Library in 1983 and then moved across to St Pancras when the library was built in the 1990s. So in the Sound Archive, we're very much like the main British Library in that we are constantly growing. We've got about 7 million sound recordings spread across about 1 million items. And this covers all genres of recorded sound, so various types of music, spoken word, natural history that I look after. And we've got over 40 different formats as well that we have to preserve and digitize. So that's from the very earliest recording medium, which wax cylinders, to the latest digital files. There are 8 curatorial areas, so it's music, spoken word, natural history. We also have a technical department, and they look after the preservation and digitization of our recordings, as well as taking their skills outside of the library, going across the world to help other archives and institutions care for their audiovisual content. And we also have a small cataloguing team, certainly in my area where it's mainly unpublished material. Curators would catalogue themselves, but we do have a few cataloguers that help with big acquisitions and a lot of the popular music material that we have, where we just have boxes and boxes and boxes of content coming in, and we need to get them catalogued and shelved. So my section, Wildlife and Environmental Sounds, that was formed in 1969. It was co-founded by Patrick Seller and Geoffrey Boswell, who was a BBC radio producer. I've got about, in terms of catalogue material, there's over 300,000 recordings of wildlife and environmental sounds, and these come from all over the world. I'm not just focused on the UK. I have a remit that's global. And that's just the material that has been catalogued down in our basements. We have plenty of collections that are still waiting to be processed. So I would estimate that we actually have double the 300,000 that we actually know about, because there's so much content still waiting to be worked through. In terms of the wildlife material, about half of the collection are bird recordings, and the rest cover mammals and amphibians, reptiles, fish, and invertebrates. We also have environmental recordings. So those would be habitat recordings. We have an excellent collection of weather recordings, water recordings. So we cover not just the species, but actually the habitats in which the species live. We have terrestrial recordings, aquatic recordings, ultrasonic recordings, infrasonic recordings made by a variety of microphones. So it's very, very varied. We cover published as well as unpublished content, which I'm going to talk about a little bit later. And we also have, which is a real pleasure to look after, the associated content. So we have photographs, we have notebooks, we have correspondence, we have recording equipment. So, really, really heavy portable equipment from say the 50s and 60s all the way up to the most recent recorders. Um, we're we were set up primarily as a scientific collection with the aim of advancing our global knowledge of natural history, and we still do that. But the remit has broadened so much in that we're not just focused on natural history in terms of serving natural history. Anybody can use a collection. We're involved with the arts, humanities, culture, all kinds of use. And so that makes it such a valuable addition to the British Library because it can be used by so many different groups, and that is our purpose after all. So, as I've just mentioned, you can kind of divide the wildlife collection into three main parts. You've got our published, unpublished, and associated content. And I'm just going to go through those three sections because they are quite different. So in terms of our published collection, we can span about 100, over a century of published wildlife sound recording. So from the very first record that was released in 1910, and that was, I'm actually just going to go back and show you. The image you see there, that was the first commercially available wildlife sound recording. It was published in 1910, and it was a recording of a captive nightingale that was made in Germany in the aviary of Karlreich in Bremen. And it was published by HMV, the gramophone company. Engineers went to his aviary and made these recordings, partially just to see if it was possible. They didn't know one way or the other, and they did it, and it was so successful, and people loved it that it really did spark this trend in a published wildlife sound recording because people could finally listen to the sounds of nature in their own homes. So, yeah, let me go. There we go. So, as I go back to the published collection, so we begin with 1910, and then we go through until the current day. Just this week, I've brought in several newly released publications. One of them is an LP of recordings at the Knepp Rewilding Estate down in Sussex. There's some sound art pieces as well. So I don't just collect identification guides. We like to show how wildlife recordings can be used in a variety of ways. So you'll have where you're bringing together maybe the manipulation of wildlife sounds or the combination of wildlife sounds and music or different sound recordings, field recordings. I also must say I look after the mechanical sounds collection at the library. I'm not an expert at all, but I do have a collecting remit for that as well. So kinds of engines and industrial sounds and things like that. So it's very interesting. They're used quite a lot in the published collection. And also this week I brought in some Australian soundscapes as well. So we're very much into making sure as much as possible we can represent the commercial aspect of wildlife sound recording, or the more publicly accessible, say. And these are just a few images of some of my favorite items from the collection. As you can imagine, there's a lot of audio identification guides for birds, but we also cover all the animal groups. So we have the famous Songs of the Humpback Whale from the 1970s, which really helped in the Save the Whales movement and bring about the moratorium on international commercial whaling. Songs of insects. These are just a few of the ones that we have, but we have so many more, and it's so much fun going down to the basements and just going through the LP racks and looking at the artworks, because it's not just about the sound recordings. People are also interested in how these recordings are packaged, presented to the public, made attractive, how they're used. So it is an important aspect of commercial sound recording. So the real heart of the collection would be its unpublished collection. This is its largest part, and this is the part that is used the most. So I had a little look the other day, and I've got responsibility for about just over 2,000 unpublished collections, and they can range from one or two recordings each in a collection to over 10,000. So it's very varied what we get. And again, they come from all over the world and come from a range of donors. So in this part of the collection, it's I'd say roughly 300,000 individually catalogued recordings. But like I said earlier, we have so many collections waiting in the basements to be digitized and catalogued. We could easily double that number, I think, if we were completely up to date. But of course, the collection is constantly growing, and there's only me working in the section. So even though I have support from across the Sound Archive, there's not enough of us to get through the content that's coming through, particularly in the age of digital recording, where you could make there are so many recordings coming in because it's so different to when people recorded on tape. Um, but that's a real strength of our collection, is just its sheer size and variety and how much potential it has. And so we're constantly working to digitize more and catalog more. I would say our strengths, as you could imagine, is the UK wildlife, European wildlife, but we also have really strong collections from Australia, Africa, South America. And that's mainly because either we have contacts with people who are working in those countries or living in those continents, or previous curators. One in particular did go across over to South America and had a few recording trips to Brazil and Peru, and so was able to go out and build the collection himself. We do have gaps as well. North America is quite a big gap, not so much Canada, but the US. And that's because we're not the only natural history sound archive in the world. There are a few others. A very big one is in New York, the Cornell Laboratory of Ornithology, where the Macaulay Library of Natural Sounds is kept. And because they have such a strong North American collection, we don't want to duplicate effort, so we sort of leave that to them. And then we focus on the UK and Europe and other areas. In terms of Asian recordings, is some areas we are very well represented, other areas not so much. Again, it just depends on who we have contacts with, who knows about us, and who we're able to reach out to when resources allow. Polar regions, quite good, but again, it's a difficult environment to record in anyway. And so there are gaps, and islands as well. I think there are so many islands where you would find endemic species, and we don't have recordings of those species or certain subspecies that sound different. So that is an area as well that we are constantly looking to develop, to make it a more richer collection and to tick off more species that we need. And the recordings come from a variety of sources. They come from scientists, they come from wildlife sound recordists, conservation organizations, broadcasters who have gone on location to make recordings, and then for a particular program, and then want somewhere to place the recordings in perpetuity. And so they will approach us, or we will approach them to see whether we are the right home for their recordings. And the image you can see on the right-hand side, this is the collection of E.D.H. Johnson, who was a wildlife sound recordist working from the 60s to the 1990s. His collection, this is an example of a collection that you get in that is an absolute joy because it's so well organized, it's beautifully laid out, everything makes sense. You can see the labels on the tape box, color coded, so they match the leader tape on the quarter-inch tape reel that we have. There are notebooks, there are photographs, there are logbooks, there are card catalogs. It's a wonderful thing. It's so useful, but it's also a very beautiful thing as well. So it's something that we often bring out for show and tells or exhibitions, just because it's such a lovely thing to look at, but also shows the importance of a very well documented collection, because we know exactly what's on there, where they came from. You can find everything. When we have collections like that, we're so happy. So associated content as well. It's so important for us to have that. I know we're a sound archive, but it's not just about the sounds. It's about having that extra contextual information that will enhance the recordings and bring the recordists behind the recordings a little bit more to life, because they're often silent in their recordings. They don't want to the focus of the recording is the species or the habitat. So you don't hear them. Sometimes they'll leave a vocal announcement at the end, but they really try as much as possible to not be in the recording. And so you don't hear them in the recording. And they sometimes are just a name in a catalogue and you don't know anything else about them. But when you get in collections where you have photos or you have notebooks, you have correspondence, or you have some of their personal objects, it really helps build up that picture of the person behind the recording, who they were, what they liked, where they lived, what they looked like, what they sounded like. And the picture of the man you can see in the far on the top right, that is E.D.H. Johnson. That came from his collection, and that's him out in the field. Probably posing with his parabolic reflector. But it's so nice to be able to see exactly what he looked like. It just brings him a little bit more to life because I never met him. And so being able to find out a little bit more about him when I talk about his collection is really helpful to me and really helpful for people who are interested in the history of wildlife sound recording as well. And these are just some other photographs from our collection of wildlife sound recordists out in the field. Um, you have Japan covered, South Africa covered, the UK. The bottom left is John Hooper, who was a chemical engineer by trade, but recorded bats as a hobby. And I say hobby, but he was so heavily involved in testing some of the earliest portable bat detectors, and he was involved in discovering that bats, each species of bat, echolocated at a certain frequency, and so you could identify the bat through its echolocation, rather than you didn't have to look at it. For example, you could identify it by its voice or its echolocation alone. And so it's just lovely to have photographs like that, so we can show people looking very happy in the field with excellent knitwear. So we have this wonderful collection of wildlife sound recordings, environmental sound recordings, but we don't just bring them into the library, catalogue them, and then just leave them there. What we do is, well, how do we use the recordings, first of all? So a couple of years ago, I worked on an exhibition at the library called Animals, Art, Science and Sound with a couple of wonderful colleagues from the visual arts section in the library. And this was the first time where we'd actually had a big exhibition that focused on natural history. We've done a lot, obviously, about literary figures, as you'd imagine, writing, music, but we'd never focused on natural history at that scale. And we brought together textual, visual, and sonic examples from across the library to put on this exhibition to show how humans have tried to document and understand the natural world over the past 2,000 years through objects in our collection. And associated with that exhibition was a book as well, not a catalogue, but LinkedIn anyway, looking at some of the library's natural history highlights. So exhibitions is always, it always works really, really well in exhibitions. Sounds have also been used to give ambience to non-natural history exhibitions in the library as well, which has worked really well. They're used heavily in the learning programs that the library puts on, and that can be anything from preschool years all the way through to adult education. And it can be used as because natural history recordings are so versatile, they can be used in so many different ways. And it's not just, you don't just have to sit there and listen. They're used to inspire artworks. They're used in activities with special needs, children that come into the library. And it's always a real joy to see how those recordings are used to kind of look at in a way, the evolution of these recordings. They come into the library, perhaps they've been recorded for a scientific project, they come into the library, archived, catalogued, but then they go out of the library. Well, in this case, they stay within the library, but they're used for different purposes, and then they will go out of the library and be used for other projects. So it's lovely to see the history of these recordings. They're also used for events in the library. So sometimes if it's a natural history event, the sound will be the focus. Other times, again, it's great for creating ambience. I think it was this year, we had an exhibition on gardening, and they played sounds of British gardens during some of the events just to get people in the mood, ready for the actual event. It's been used for social media, conferences and publications, radio programs, fundraising activities. If you have people that are particularly interested in wildlife sounds, and show and tells as well. And that can be anything from having your peers come across from other natural history institutions and showing them what we have, to diplomatic visits. If people are interested in wildlife, it works very well. And that would be a mixture of showing the published material, unpublished, associated content, just showing everything that we have, and then playing some sounds as well, hopefully. So, do that again. Oops. So I've explained how we use the recordings in the library itself, but then how are recordings used externally? Because that was the point of the section being set up, the wildlife and environmental sound section. Its first aim was to be this repository, this permanent repository for natural history recordings, for wildlife recordings, so that they could be preserved in perpetuity for future generations. But then it was also meant to be this bank of material that could then be accessed by people outside of the library, perhaps working for research, perhaps for their own personal enjoyment. It's always been heavily used for scientific research, whether that is taxonomic studies, whether that's animal behavior studies. They have been used, as you can imagine, in playback studies. So the paper that you can see on the right, that was where recordings from the collection were taken out into the field by researchers looking for this highly endangered songbird from Kenya. And the recordings were played back into the environment and they got a response. And so they were able to identify this previously unknown subpopulation of this species. And then they could lobby for extra protection for the habitat. And we've seen that quite a bit. And I would say, again, 50% of the inquiries that I get are to access recordings for scientific research. And we're getting more and more inquiries for machine learning as well. So taking large amounts of data, as much as we're able to give anyway, given the current circumstances at the library. But that's a big thing, the automated recognition of species within recordings. It's also used for arts and humanities research. So people that are interested in they're interested in the history of sound recording, for example, or they're interested in these fusions of art and science and the outputs of that coming together of different subject areas. Education and learning, so in museums or galleries, with the touch buttons where you can hear the sounds, that's always a popular use of our recordings. Musicians and artists love to take the recordings and work with them. Sometimes they will incorporate them straight into their music. Sometimes they will manipulate them to make them sound completely different. And it's always interesting for us to see the end result as well, to see how they've taken these raw field recordings and turned them into something more artistic. Exhibitions and installations across the country and across the world. So that's always exciting, working with people putting on exhibitions, artists, particularly if sound is not their first medium and they're incorporating it alongside other material. So that's always exciting. And radio broadcasts as well. There was a BBC Radio 4 program, a series, must be 10 years ago now, actually, or even more, called Noise, A Human History. And that incorporated quite a lot of our wildlife recordings into the program. So for me as a curator, it's very interesting to be able to have such a diversity of inquiries and be able to work on such a diversity of projects and just help out wherever we can, and then to see the end result, and it makes it all worthwhile. So I thought, since I've been talking about wildlife sound recording, perhaps we should take a moment to go back to the very beginning and look at where it all started in terms of who made the first wildlife sound recording. And that would be Ludwig Koch, German wildlife sound recordist pioneer. He made the first recording of an animal that we know of in 1889. He was only 8 years old at the time. His father had brought him back an Edison phonograph and a box of wax cylinders as a birthday present. And it's funny how that little birthday present just propelled him or sparked this lifelong interest in sound and put him on this path that was to see him become pioneer in wildlife sound recording. So I'm just going to play this recording. It was of a white-rumped charmer, Indian songbird that was a pet of his, and he made this recording at the age of 8. It's lovely to all the crackle, it's not very cleaned up. It's perfect. The original cylinder has sadly been lost. I think he wasn't able to bring it with him when he left Germany to come over to Britain in 1936, but he had made a transfer and shared that with others, and so that's how we can hear it now. So in the 1920s and 30s, Ludwig made recordings for the first audio identification guides for European birds, first in his native Germany and then over in the UK. So Songs of Wild Birds was the first British audio identification guide, consisting of two double-sided shellac discs and a book. And that was published in 1936. So as soon as Ludwig came over to the UK, he basically got working and met a variety of people. I thought, right, let's get the first British Audio Identification Guide out. So he did that in 1936, follow up in 1937. In 1940, he joined the BBC as a broadcaster and a location recordist. He was very well known on the World Service, so he would have his own programs, and he really was responsible for bringing the sounds of nature into the homes of people in the UK and also all over the world through his work with the World Service. So Julian May, a BBC radio programmes producer, wrote that Ludwig Koch was once as famous as David Attenborough, which is quite a statement, as pioneering as Blue Planet and as important as the BBC Natural History Unit. And that's because at the time in the 30s, there weren't that many people sound recording was still a very new medium. I mean, it's only been around for about 50 years, and there were very few people making wildlife sound recordings out in the field. It was slightly easier with captive animals, but going out into the field where the massive recording van and wax discs that you'd have to record into and cables upon cables upon cables, it was such a difficult task, and yet Ludwig was one of those people that just did not give up and just carried on and overcame all of these challenges, making it easier for the generations to follow. So in 1955, his autobiography, Memoirs of a Birdman, was published, which is a very interesting read. I recommend anyone to read it. And in 1960, he was awarded an MBE for his services to natural history. We have his archive at the library, his manuscripts archive, his test pressings, his photographic material, a whole range of materials, published works, and he's a really fascinating character. And I'm hoping one day to do a small exhibition showcasing some of the collection items from his collection and some of his recordings as well. So, right, good. So, since I'm talking to the London Natural History Society, I thought I should spend a little bit of time looking at our London wildlife sounds that we have. I should say that the library was hit by a cyber attack in 2023, which has meant that we still can't access a lot of our recordings. Otherwise, I would have played you a lot more, but there's only a small amount that I can get at the moment. But luckily, I've got a few London ones for you. So I have in terms of catalogue material, about 3,000 unpublished recordings of wildlife and environmental sounds from across the capital. There's more to come. Earlier in the summer, I went and collected Patrick Sellers' collection. A lot of that was made in South London, and that will be digitised hopefully next year. So we'll be adding to our South London holdings. Some of the key places, or some of the familiar places, well-known places where we have recordings from would be Kensington Gardens, Hyde Park, Walthamstow Marshes, Islington, got Nunhead Cemetery, Richmond Park, Wembley, Wimbledon, Croydon. There's plenty of places that we have recordings from. This one is right near the library. Obviously, it's King's Cross. And this was a recording made by Julian Bircher in 1996 of a black redstart. And this is, I'll play it, but it's a wonderful recording that shows, you've got the wildlife sound and then you're in the heart of the city. So it really is a good example of a London wildlife recording. when I started working at the library, we're dead opposite St Pancras Station, and St Pancras was derelict at the time. And both me and the curator at the time, we could both hear there was a black red star on top of St Pancras Station singing. And you could, if you listen closer, you could hear it over all the taxis. I haven't heard it since St Pancras has been, you know, gentrified and opened and made wonderful. But at the time, it was really lovely to be able to hear his Black Red Star on my way to work. As I said earlier, also collect environmental sounds. Weather is quite a personal favourite of mine, and this is a recording of a hailstorm in Hackney that was made in 2012 by well, the sound recordist Richard Beard, who I believe was a member of the London Natural History Society before he sadly passed away. In terms of our earliest London recordings, these were made at London Zoo. So I know they're captive animals, but they still fall under our London wildlife sounds or animal sounds. Um, this was a project between Ludwig Koch and Julian Huxley, who was then Secretary of the Zoological Society of London. And they worked on a book called Animal Language, which was the first book really to use text, images, and sound recordings to explore sound communication in animals. And it was quite a large book with two double-sided shellac discs. And then it was republished in 1964, I believe, where it was two smaller vinyl discs. So the recordings were made by Ludwig Koch in London Zoo and also Whipsnade during 1937 to 1938. He had to borrow the Parlophone. I think it was like a 7-ton Parlophone recording van, which had a little oven inside it, where he could heat up his wax discs to a certain temperature so that the wax wasn't too hard but wasn't too soft. And then he could make his recordings. So he'd make a number of these wax disc recordings. Then he'd have to go back to the studio, press them, to create shellac discs, his test pressings, and then you could listen to them to work out which was the best recording. So there was no previewing the sounds back in the 1930s. You just had to keep your fingers crossed or rely on your skills, which Ludwig Koch did, to make sure you got a good recording. Otherwise, it would have been a wasted journey. So in the library, so he recorded a wide range of animals at both zoos. I'll play you now, actually, the Arabian camel that was made at London Zoo. And there's this really, really good story in Animal Language where they write, I think Julian Huxley writes that Ludwig Koch had gone to record the African wild dogs. He had set up all of his equipment, took cages, mic'd up the cages, was ready to go. And his Julian said that the dogs just looked at him and turned their heads away and didn't utter a single sound, even though they'd been vocalizing throughout the day. As soon as he turned up and was ready to record, they didn't want to do it. So that's why it's very difficult recording animals. You can't just get them to perform on demand. So that Arabian camel recording was made in 1937, and about 50 years later, the previous wildlife curator in the Sound Archive, Richard Ranft, went back to London Zoo and made some new recordings. He recorded a wide range of animals, but he did spend some time in the reptile house and recorded some snakes. This recording is of a western diamond-backed rattlesnake that Richard made, and you can hear that the snake wasn't very happy to begin with, and then Richard does something, and the snake is really not happy at all. So, and you'll know when this happens. So I'll play it now. And there's another recording of a cobra who that was equally unhappy and was hissing at Richard, and then you hear it just go for the microphone. So I don't think the snakes like Richard very much. Um, So that does bring me to the end of my talk. Thank you for bearing with me. As I say, a lot of our material is still sadly unavailable for listening online because of the cyber attack and how we're still rebuilding our systems and services. If you wanted to listen to some other recordings from the collection, we do have a growing number on the British Library's SoundCloud account that you can go to and listen to, and some lovely species recordings and environmental recordings. There's also some hour-long programs on NTS Radio where we've put together curated playlists that you can listen to. And if there are any recordists out there that have collections and are wondering, is there somewhere that would be interested in archiving them? We definitely would be. So please do get in touch. I'm in half a mind to play this recording. I might do it anyway. It's very, very short because we're almost at Christmas. It always comes up in our little Christmas party at the library. So I'm going to play it anyway. And apologies because it's a little bit cheesy, but here we go. And that was the Singing Dogs, Jingle Bells, 1971. Carl Weissman, Danish wildlife sound recording. He'd gone around Copenhagen making recordings of dogs for another program. Had all of these offcuts or outtakes, and thought, oh, I could set them to a musical scale. Why don't I do that? And then he put them to Jingle Bells. So Merry Christmas. Thank you.
Thank, thank you so much, Cheryl. That was a really interesting, fascinating talk. If we can just stop the recording.